What happens when a single piece of inherited jewelry can unravel the foundation of one of America's most powerful political dynasties? For Jennifer Walsh, a 29-year-old coffee shop manager struggling to pay her mother's nursing home bills, that piece was an antique emerald necklace her grandmother had left her. For Senator Robert Ashford, the pharmaceutical heir whose family had controlled state politics for 3 generations, it was a ghost from his past that threatened to expose the darkest chapter in his family's rise to power. She was just trying to serve coffee to the political elite at their private fundraiser. He was just another powerful man used to invisible service. But when her grandmother's emerald necklace caught the light during service, revealing an inscription that matched the one on his family's signet ring, both their worlds would collide in ways that would shake the very foundations of power. This isn't a story about politics. This is about how a single moment of recognition can expose decades of buried crimes, and how sometimes the most dangerous truths are hidden in plain sight. The crystal chandeliers of the Wellington Country Club cast prismatic light across the mahogany walls, illuminating oil paintings of long-dead senators and governors. At 8:30 on a Friday evening, the club's private dining room hummed with the polished conversations of political power brokers, their voices mixing with the soft clink of champagne glasses and the distant sound of a string quartet. Jennifer Walsh moved between the tables with quiet efficiency, her black catering uniform marking her as part of the invisible army that served the state's political elite. Every muscle in her body ached from working 14-hour days between the coffee shop and her evening catering gigs. But her mother's care at Maplewood Nursing Home wasn't going to pay for itself. The specialized dementia unit was the only thing keeping her mother safe, and Jennifer's multiple jobs were all that stood between her and the horrifying prospect of state care. The antique emerald necklace at her throat had belonged to her grandmother, Rose Walsh, a woman who had raised Jennifer after her father abandoned them, and her mother's mental health began to deteriorate. It was an elegant Victorian piece, a teardrop emerald, surrounded by tiny diamonds, hanging from a delicate gold chain. The back of the pendant was engraved with words in Latin that Jennifer had never bothered to translate. Despite her desperate financial situation, she had never considered selling it. Grandmother Rose had made her promise to keep it always, claiming it was proof of something important that the family must never forget. At the head table, a man in his 60s sat reviewing notes for his upcoming speech, his presence commanding attention without effort. Senator Robert Ashford was silver-haired and distinguished, with the kind of polished authority that came from 3 generations of political power. His navy suit was perfectly tailored, and the gold signet ring on his right hand bore his family crest, a symbol of the pharmaceutical empire that had launched his family's political dynasty. He owned controlling interests in several major drug companies and used his Senate position to protect the industry's interests. As Jennifer approached with the senator's requested scotch, her exhaustion finally caught up with her. The thick oriental rug shifted under her heel, sending her stumbling forward. She managed to steady the glass, but her necklace swung out from her uniform, catching the chandelier light and casting emerald reflections across the white tablecloth. Senator Ashford looked up from his notes, and his steel-grey eyes locked onto the pendant with an expression of absolute shock. The color drained from his distinguished face as if he had seen a revenant rise from the grave. "Where did you get that necklace?" His voice was barely controlled, each word precise and deadly. Jennifer's heart raced. "It was my grandmother's, sir. Rose Walsh. She passed it down to me." Ashford's hand moved instinctively to his signet ring, his fingers tracing the family crest with trembling intensity. "Rose Walsh," he repeated, the name falling from his lips like a confession. "What was her maiden name?" "Donovan," Jennifer replied, confused by the intensity of his reaction. "Rose Donovan before she married my grandfather." The silence that followed was deafening. Around them, the political fundraiser continued, but Senator Ashford seemed frozen in place, staring at the emerald pendant as if it held the power to destroy him. Rose Donovan died 40 years ago, he whispered finally. She was a pharmaceutical researcher. She was killed in a laboratory accident at Ashford Industries. The words hit Jennifer like physical blows. That's impossible. Grandmother Rose lived until 2020. She was 93 when she died. She told me stories about her work as a scientist, about discovering something terrible that powerful people wanted to bury. Ashford's face went ashen. What did she tell you about that? Jennifer glanced around nervously, aware that other guests were beginning to notice their intense conversation. She said she had uncovered evidence that a drug company was covering up dangerous side effects in their medications, that they were letting people die rather than lose profits. She had to disappear because they threatened to kill her if she exposed the truth. The senator's breathing became labored. He reached into his jacket and withdrew a small leather notebook, flipping to a specific page. There, pressed between the pages like a dried flower, was a photograph of a young woman with intelligent eyes and a warm smile. She was wearing the exact same emerald necklace that now hung around Jennifer's neck. Rose Donovan, he said, his voice breaking. She was supposed to marry my father, Charles Ashford. Instead, she died in what was ruled an accidental chemical explosion in 1983. Jennifer studied the photograph, her mind reeling. The woman in the picture could have been her twin, separated by 4 decades. If Rose Donovan is my grandmother, Jennifer said slowly, and she was supposed to marry your father, then you're not just some caterer who happened to serve me tonight, Ashford replied, his voice hollow with realization. You're the granddaughter of the woman whose death launched my family's political career. You're living proof that our greatest crime wasn't buried as completely as we believed. The emerald pendant seemed to pulse with its own light, casting dancing shadows on the white tablecloth. It was more than jewelry, it was evidence, a witness to secrets that had shaped decades of political power. But Rose Donovan hadn't died in that laboratory explosion. She had survived, escaped, built a new life under a new identity. And now her granddaughter sat in the heart of the very institution that had tried to destroy her, wearing the proof that could bring down a dynasty. The following morning, Jennifer found herself in Senator Ashford's private study at his Georgetown estate, a mansion that represented generations of pharmaceutical wealth converted into political influence. The room was lined with law books and framed photographs of the senator with presidents and foreign dignitaries. I need to show you something, Ashford said, his voice heavy with decades of suppressed guilt. He moved to a concealed safe behind a portrait of his grandfather, the founder of Ashford Industries. He withdrew a manila folder thick with documents and spread its contents across his mahogany desk. Inside were laboratory reports, internal memos and correspondence that made Jennifer's blood run cold. The truth about what happened in 1983, Ashford began, is that Rose discovered our company was covering up severe side effects in our new arthritis medication, Rumor-Cure. The drug was causing liver damage, kidney failure, and in some cases, death. But we were months away from FDA approval and had already invested hundreds of millions in development. Jennifer picked up one of the laboratory reports, her hands shaking as she read Rose's meticulous documentation of the drug's deadly effects. She tried to stop the approval process. She did more than try, Ashford said bitterly. She had compiled irrefutable evidence that we knew the drug was killing people. She was going to present it to the FDA the Monday after the explosion. The testimony would have destroyed our company and sent my father to prison. He pulled out a series of internal memos marked confidential that detailed the company's plan to discredit Rose's research and suppress her findings. The explosion wasn't an accident, Jennifer said, the horrible truth crystallizing in her mind. My father ordered it, Ashford confirmed, his voice cracking. He had Rose's laboratory rigged to explode, making it look like she had mishandled dangerous chemicals. The blast destroyed all her research, and everyone assumed she had died in the fire. Jennifer thought of her grandmother's stories, the nightmares that had haunted her well into her 80s. The way she would sometimes wake up screaming about fire and chemicals. But she escaped, Jennifer said softly. Somehow, yes. She must have left the lab before the explosion, maybe to get additional evidence or meet with a colleague. When the building went up, everyone assumed she was inside. My father declared her a tragic victim of industrial accident and used the sympathy to push through Rumacure's approval anyway. The scope of the conspiracy was staggering. How many people died from the drug? Ashford closed his eyes. The official count was never released, but our internal estimates suggested over 3,000 deaths in the first 5 years. We settled lawsuits quietly, buried the evidence, and eventually reformulated the drug to remove the most dangerous compounds. And your political career was built on the profits from those deaths, Jennifer said, the accusation hanging heavy in the air. Every campaign, every office, every piece of legislation I've ever touched, it all traces back to blood money from Rumacure, Ashford admitted. I've spent 40 years trying to atone for my father's crimes, but I was too much of a coward to expose the truth. Before Jennifer could respond, the study door burst open. A woman in her 50s entered without knocking, her expensive suit and perfect makeup creating an armor of political respectability. Behind her came a younger man who shared Ashford's features, but none of his evident conscience. "Father?" the woman said, her voice sharp with suspicion. "Mrs. Patterson said you brought a visitor to the house. How unusual." "Diane," Ashford said, his tone immediately guarded. "This is Jennifer Walsh. Jennifer, my daughter, Congresswoman Diane Ashford Reynolds, and my son David Ashford." Diane's calculating gaze swept over Jennifer's modest clothing with barely concealed disdain. "And what brings Miss Walsh to our family home?" "Jennifer is Rose Donovan's granddaughter," Ashford said simply. The effect was instantaneous. Both siblings went rigid, and David actually took a step backward. The name hung in the air like a curse. "And that's impossible," Diane breathed. "Rose Donovan died in the laboratory explosion. It was 40 years ago. Apparently she survived," Ashford replied. "She changed her identity and built a new life. Jennifer is living proof that the family's darkest secret wasn't buried as completely as we thought." David found his voice first, his tone sharp with panic. "This is insane. Some random caterer shows up with a piece of jewelry and a wild story, and you're ready to confess to crimes that happened before she was born. She's obviously running a blackmail scheme." "The necklace is authentic," Ashford said coldly. "It matches the one in the photograph from Rose's personnel file, and her story explains inconsistencies about that night that have never made sense." Diane moved closer to the desk, studying the documents with the intensity of a politician calculating damage control. "Even if this fantasy were true," she said slowly, "it changes nothing. Rose Donovan has no legal standing. She was never part of this family. But her descendant might have a moral claim to justice," Ashford said quietly. The words hit like a thunderbolt. Diane's composed mask cracked, revealing the naked ambition underneath. "What exactly are you suggesting, Father?" she demanded. "I'm suggesting that maybe it's time this family faced the consequences of our crimes. Maybe it's time we made restitution for the lives that were lost." "Restitution?" David laughed harshly. "You want to destroy our family's legacy based on the delusions of some opportunistic stranger. I want to stop living with the knowledge that our wealth and power are built on the graves of innocent people." Ashford shot back. The tension in the room was suffocating. Jennifer could see the cold calculation in both siblings' eyes as they assessed how this revelation threatened not just their inheritance, but their own political careers. "I think," Diane said with dangerous calm, "that we need to be very careful about entertaining unsubstantiated claims from outsiders. The Ashford family name represents generations of public service. It would be tragic if our reputation were damaged by someone with questionable motives." The threat was subtle, but unmistakable. Jennifer felt the same chill her grandmother must have experienced all those years ago when powerful people decided she was too dangerous to live. "Are you threatening her?" Ashford asked, his voice deadly quiet. "I'm protecting this family," Diane replied smoothly, "as someone should have done 40 years ago." Jennifer realized, with growing horror, that she had walked into the same trap that had nearly killed her grandmother. The Ashford family's willingness to commit murder to protect their secrets hadn't died with Charles Ashford. It had simply evolved into more sophisticated forms of destruction. The war for the truth had begun, and the stakes were higher than ever. Over the following weeks, the attacks were surgical and devastating. Jennifer's coffee shop suddenly failed a health inspection that had been passed just months earlier, forcing an expensive closure for remediation. Her mother's nursing home informed her that there had been irregularities in the payment history that required immediate resolution. Jennifer's bank account was frozen pending an investigation into suspicious deposits that turned out to be her own legitimate earnings. When she found a letter in her mailbox offering to purchase her grandmother's necklace for a generous sum, with no signature or return address, she knew the full weight of the Ashford political machine was being brought to bear against her. Senator Ashford, meanwhile, was conducting his own investigation into the rumor cure cover-up. Using his congressional resources, he uncovered evidence that the conspiracy had been even more extensive than he had originally known. It wasn't just one drug, he told Jennifer during a clandestine meeting in a park outside the city. Rose had discovered a pattern of cover-ups spanning multiple medications. The Rumacure incident was just the tip of the iceberg. How many people died? Jennifer asked, though she wasn't sure she wanted to know the answer. Tens of thousands, possibly more. And it's still happening. Diane and David have continued the practice through their political positions, blocking safety investigations, fast-tracking approvals for dangerous drugs, taking millions in pharmaceutical lobbying money. The revelation was staggering in its scope. Jennifer was beginning to understand that her grandmother hadn't just discovered a single corporate crime. She had stumbled onto a systematic pattern of corruption that had shaped American healthcare policy for decades. The breaking point came when Jennifer arrived at her mother's nursing home to find her being transferred to a state facility. The administrator explained apologetically that there had been questions raised about the legitimacy of her mother's diagnosis and treatment needs. "I don't understand," Jennifer said, her voice shaking with barely controlled fury. "Her condition is well documented. Her doctors have all confirmed there's been a review of her case," the administrator said uncomfortably. "Questions about whether she truly requires this level of specialized care." "I'm sorry, Miss Walsh, the decision has been made." Jennifer knew with absolute certainty who was behind this. She also knew that her mother, in her current mental state, wouldn't survive the trauma of being moved to an underfunded state facility. That night, she called Senator Ashford from a payphone outside the nursing home. "They're going to kill her," she said without preamble. "Just like they tried to kill Rose." "Who? What happened?" She told him about the transfer, the manufactured questions about her mother's care, the systematic destruction of everything she held dear. As she spoke, she could hear Ashford's breathing grow harsh with rage. 40 years, he said finally. 40 years, and they're still using the same tactics, still destroying innocent lives to protect their secrets. "I can't fight them," Jennifer said, her voice breaking. "I don't have their resources, their connections." "But you have something they don't," Ashford interrupted. "You have the truth. And you have me. I've been a coward for 4 decades, but I won't be one anymore. Are you ready to finish what your grandmother started?" Jennifer thought of Rose's final words to her. "The truth always finds a way to surface, honey. Sometimes it just takes the right person to dig it up." "Yes," she said, her voice steady with newfound determination. "Tell me what we need to do." The annual Congressional Healthcare Summit was held in the marble halls of the Capitol building, where pharmaceutical lobbyists mingled with senators and representatives in a carefully choreographed dance of influence and money. It was the most important healthcare policy event of the year, where billion-dollar decisions were made behind closed doors. Jennifer had never imagined she would set foot in such a place. The building's classical architecture and soaring columns represented the pinnacle of American political power, and she felt like an intruder in the professional attire Senator Ashford had insisted she wear. "This is where it ends," he had told her during their final planning session. "In front of everyone who has benefited from our family's crimes." Diane and David worked the room with practiced skill, their political smiles never faltering even as they kept careful watch on their father. They had grown increasingly concerned about his erratic behavior in recent weeks, his obsession with ancient family history, and most disturbing of all, his growing alliance with the caterer who claimed to be connected to a woman who had died decades ago. The summit's keynote session proceeded normally through the morning panels and networking lunch. Politicians and pharmaceutical executives congratulated themselves on their collaborative efforts to improve American healthcare while carefully avoiding any mention of the astronomical drug prices and suppressed safety data that had made their wealth possible. But when Senator Ashford took the podium for his scheduled remarks on pharmaceutical innovation, something was different in his demeanor, a tension that suggested the afternoon was about to take an unexpected turn. "Ladies and gentlemen," he began, his voice carrying clearly through the chamber's amplification system, "today I want to talk to you about the true cost of medical progress." A murmur ran through the distinguished audience. This wasn't the expected speech about industry partnership and regulatory efficiency. 40 years ago, Ashford continued, my family made a decision that has haunted me ever since. To protect our profits and silence a whistleblower, we orchestrated the murder of a brilliant scientist who tried to save lives by exposing the truth about dangerous medications. The murmur grew to shocked gasps. Diane was pushing through the crowd toward the podium, her face pale with panic. The woman who died trying to protect American patients was named Rose Donovan. She was a researcher at Ashford Industries, and she had compiled irrefutable evidence that we were knowingly marketing drugs that killed people. A spotlight found Jennifer in the audience. She lifted her chin, meeting Ashford's gaze across the chamber with steady resolve. But Rose Donovan didn't die in that laboratory explosion. She survived, changed her identity, and spent the rest of her life in hiding, too afraid to come forward with the truth she had died trying to reveal. Diane reached the side of the podium and was frantically gesturing to the event coordinator, trying to get him to cut the microphone. But like everyone else in the chamber, the coordinator was transfixed by the unfolding confession. "Today," Ashford said, his voice growing stronger, "I'm proud to introduce Rose Donovan's granddaughter, Jennifer Walsh, who has helped me uncover the full scope of our family's crimes against the American people." The chamber erupted in chaos. Some attendees were applauding, others were arguing loudly, and several pharmaceutical executives were heading for the exits. But Ashford wasn't finished. "I'm also announcing that I've discovered evidence of ongoing criminal activity within my own family. My children have continued our tradition of suppressing safety data, blocking investigations, and taking money to protect dangerous drugs." He looked directly at Diane and David, who had both gone white as marble. "This evidence has been turned over to federal prosecutors and the FDA. Anyone involved in this decades-long conspiracy against public health will be held accountable." Diane's political composure finally shattered completely. "You delusional old fool!" she screamed, her voice carrying even without amplification. "She's nothing but an extortionist, a nobody trying to destroy our family's legacy." "Legacy?" Ashford's voice cut through her hysteria. "What legacy, Diane?" "The legacy of blood money, the legacy of dead patients and suppressed research." He gestured to Jennifer, who was walking toward the podium, with her head held high, despite the hundreds of eyes upon her. Rose Donovan was 28 when she discovered that the family she was going to marry into was built on mass murder. Ashford continued as Jennifer joined him at the podium. "She chose public health over personal security, truth over comfort. She gave up everything, her name, her career, her future, to try to save lives. His voice broke with 4 decades of suppressed emotion. "I can't give Rose back the life she lost. I can't undo 40 years of hiding and fear. But I can make sure her sacrifice wasn't in vain." He turned to Jennifer, taking her hands in his. "I can't replace your grandmother, and I can't erase the struggles your family has faced because of mine. But I can promise you this: the Ashford name will never again be used to silence truth or harm innocent people." He faced the stunned assembly once more. "Effective immediately, I'm resigning from the Senate and liquidating all Ashford pharmaceutical holdings. The proceeds will fund a new foundation dedicated to drug safety research and supporting the families of those killed by corporate medical negligence." The chamber had fallen into stunned silence. Even Diane stood frozen, realizing that her father's public confession had destroyed any chance of containing the scandal or maintaining their political dynasty. Jennifer felt tears streaming down her cheeks as she looked out at the crowd of senators, representatives, and pharmaceutical executives. These were the people who had shaped healthcare policy for generations, untouchable in their wealth and influence. But today, for the first time in her life, she felt their equal. "My grandmother Rose used to tell me that the dead patients don't rest easy when their deaths serve corporate profits," she said, her voice steady despite her emotion. "She said that someday someone would have the courage to speak for those who could no longer speak for themselves." She looked at Diane and David, who stood amid the wreckage of their carefully constructed political careers. Today is that someday? The aftermath of the Healthcare Summit sent shockwaves through Washington and the pharmaceutical industry. Diane and David were arrested within days on charges ranging from bribery to conspiracy to suppress evidence. The investigation that followed uncovered a decades-long pattern of corruption that reached into the highest levels of government and corporate America. The revelation about Rose Donovan's murder triggered congressional hearings that exposed systematic suppression of drug safety data, leading to the largest pharmaceutical regulatory reform in American history. The Ashford political dynasty, built on the foundation of medical corruption, faced complete destruction. But from the ashes of the old regime, something meaningful began to emerge. 8 months after the summit, Jennifer stood in the sunlit atrium of the Rose Donovan Institute for Drug Safety, watching as researchers and advocates prepared for the facility's grand opening. Her mother, her dementia stabilized thanks to experimental treatments the new foundation had funded, sat nearby in a wheelchair, her eyes bright with moments of clarity. "She would have been so proud," her mother said during one of her lucid moments, gesturing to the bustling activity around them. "Rose always said that every person who dies from corporate greed should be remembered. The Institute would provide independent drug testing, safety advocacy, and support services for patients harmed by pharmaceutical negligence. It was the first of many projects funded by the liquidated Ashford fortune, now dedicated to protecting the people the family had spent generations exploiting. Senator Ashford, now simply Robert, approached from across the atrium, moving with the careful steps of a man who had carried guilt for 40 years, but was finally learning to transform it into purpose. "The dedication ceremony is about to begin," he said, offering Jennifer his arm. "Ready to honor your grandmother's memory properly?" Jennifer smiled, touching the emerald necklace at her throat, the same piece that had started this extraordinary journey. She had it appraised and learned that the Latin inscription read, "Veritas vincit," truth conquers. "I think she's been waiting for this day for 40 years. Jennifer said as they walked toward the auditorium where hundreds of patient advocates and families of pharmaceutical victims waited, not wealthy donors this time, but the people whose lives would be protected by Rose's legacy. Robert squeezed her arm gently. She raised a granddaughter who finished what she started. As Jennifer stepped up to address the crowd, she thought about the incredible journey that had brought her here, from a struggling coffee shop manager to the heir of a legacy built on her grandmother's courage. And finally, to someone who could transform that legacy into something Rose would have been proud of. The truth had indeed surfaced, just as her grandmother had always believed it would. And in its wake had come not just justice, but the rarest gift of all, the chance to turn a story of tragedy into a testament to the power of one person's refusal to let injustice prevail. Standing at the podium, looking out at faces that reflected the struggles of patients and families everywhere, Jennifer began her speech with the words her grandmother had whispered to her so many years ago. The dead don't rest easy when their deaths serve corporate profits. Today, we're not just opening a research institute. We're proving that no amount of money or political power can silence the truth forever. In the audience, she could see Robert wiping away tears, and she knew that somewhere Rose Donovan was finally at peace. Her battle against corporate corruption hadn't ended in defeat after all. It had just taken 40 years to find its way to victory. The story of Jennifer Walsh and Robert Ashford reminds us that the courage to challenge institutional corruption can echo across generations. Sometimes it takes an outsider with nothing to lose to show us that our greatest weapon against systemic injustice isn't money or connections, but the simple refusal to let truth remain buried. Rose Donovan never got to see the pharmaceutical empire that silenced her transformed into a force for patient protection and drug safety. But through her granddaughter, her unwavering commitment to scientific integrity became the foundation of a new kind of legacy. One that proved the most powerful force against corporate corruption is simply refusing to let it remain hidden. What would you have done in Jennifer's place? Would you have had the courage to challenge a political dynasty, even knowing it could cost you everything you held dear? If this story moved you, please share it with someone who believes in the power of ordinary people to hold powerful institutions accountable. Don't forget to follow our channel for more stories that celebrate the triumph of truth over corruption and justice over greed. And remember, sometimes the most important battles are fought not with money or influence, but with the simple determination to honor the dead by protecting the living. Thank you for listening to this tale of courage, sacrifice, and the incredible power of one person's refusal to let corporate murder be forgotten.